as Dr. Stockwell mentioned, my name is Rashad Alghamdi. I'm a PhD candidate and homed in the Soil Science Department, working with Dr. Larry Cihacek. And my topic today is about nitrogen mineralization dynamics of post-harvest crop residue in no-till systems. Soil is a limited resource, and farmers till their land and use the mechanical tillage in order for them to prepare the soil for seed germination and for plant support. There are different forms of agriculture tillage out there. Basically, it's divided into two categories: conventional tillage and conservation tillage. Those categories are based off the amount of residue left on the soil surface, the previous crop residue left on the soil surface. If it is 30% and more, it would be considered a conservation tillage. If it is less than that, it would be considered a conventional tillage system. And even with that, there are many tools out there for the tillage itself. It depends on the frequency of soil disturbance and the passes, how many passes farmers go through the soil itself. And that will create more disturbance into the soil, which will also reduce the amount of the residue, the crop residue left in the soil surface. The least conservative tillage out there is considered deep ripper, or that's for the conservation tillage. If you were talking about conventional tillage, we'll talk about disc plow or moldboard plow, which means they have less amount of residue left in the soil surface, a lot of disturbance. And the most conservative tillage out there is the no-till system. And that's the one we talk about and we worry about. No-till system is not no subject. It's been out there for a long time. Sumerians in the past days, which is called now Iraq, they used planting sticks in uncultivated land to plant their seeds. Also, the Native Americans here, they use their hoe for using it for tilling their land and also for planting their seeds in uncultivated land. They use fish as a type of fertilizer. They burn their residue to bring up the calcium and magnesium and different minerals up to the soil. The advancement of technology, the population grows worldwide, and the need of agricultural production became also a necessity and became in a larger scale. In the mid-20s to early 30s, people start to claim more land and to till it for agricultural purposes, to the point where we had severe drought in the early 30s. All of us know about what happened: the Dust Bowl, the severe drought caused wind, with the wind velocity caused wind erosion. And because of that, people start to think, well, why don't we go back to the concept of no-till system? Basically, this is in here a picture of the John Deere or of the grassland drill, and it's a series of coulters, goes through uncultivated land, and behind those coulters there are like pipe where it drops the seed in those cultivated or on those series of the slot itself where they plant their seed. That was early in the 1950s. And why is that? Because we all know about the benefit of the conservation tillage, the benefit of doing the conservation tillage, the no-till system versus tilling the land. When we till the land, we will have a lot more of water pollution. We will have a lot erosion, and we will lose also soil. We will have even soil compaction, which will restrict plant growth. But if we don't have it, then we'll have, or farmers will have better, like they'll save time and they'll save costs. They'll also improve the soil aggregation for their land. They'll increase the amount of organic matter left in the soil surface, and they'll increase the biota life, and they'll reduce the wind erosion. They will increase and improve the amount of water infiltration for the conservation tillage. They will also have reduction of, as I mentioned earlier, the water pollution, and they will also recycle the nutrients back to the soil. U.S. Great Plains covers 10 states in the United States plus Canada. In the northern part, or in general, U.S. Great Plains, actually, it's a semi-arid region. In the northern part, the sediment there is based on glaciation sediments. And even, or in the most of the northern Great Plains, the crop there is based on rain-fed crops. So it depends on the weather itself. In North Dakota, if we only look at the state of North Dakota, I'm displaying here the data of 3 different cities in the state of in the state of North Dakota. Fargo representing the eastern part of the state, Dickinson the western part, and Carrington the mid-east part. And that's basically based in Indon data from the average growing season for about 30 years. And what we see in here is that even for the state of North Dakota, we have variation from east to west. On the eastern part, we have the highest amount of precipitation compared to the western part of North Dakota. And even if we only look at the eastern part or the western part, we also see some variations based on year to year, which we call wet and dry cycles. So weather is unpredictable. And in order for farmers to adapt to the extreme weather conditions, then farmers start to shift from the monoculture practice, wheat, summer fallow, to more of a crop diversification tillage practice, more of adapting like small grains such as corn, soybean, and even cover crop, mixing some cover crop there. In the state of North Dakota, there are 11 million hectares of cropland reside in the state, and most of those are managed under conservation tillage, whether it's reduced till practice or no-till systems, which means we will have a lot of residue left in the soil surface. This is a picture of a no-till system, and a study in the state of North Dakota stated an observation of accumulation of up to 10 megagram of residue left on long-term no-till system. That's a lot of residue left leaving in the soil surface. Work I did with Dr. Erin Day in 2015 and 2017 for my second master. It's about soil warming and drying. And basically what we found is conservation tillage in general, such as vertical till and strip till and no-till in here, have more moisture in the time when the plants need it the most. And specifically, if we look at the no-till system all the way to the left side, we see it displays that it has about 32% of soil volumetric water content, even deeper in the soil profile. The reason why is because the amount of residue left in the soil surface act as insulator, reflecting the solar waves, and also reducing the amount of evapotranspiration. In the northern soils, where summer is cooler and shorter, we would expect to have less decomposition of organic matter, and that's the statement from Campbell versus southern soils. Samford and Smith looked at different orders of soils and stated that North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota have significant amount of organic nitrogen, but small amount of that is mineralizable. So, what is important for the farmer? Well, farmers worry about the amount of residue or worry about if there is nitrogen mineralizing out from those residue. Do I have enough nitrogen to support the succeeding crop or not? And will I have better nitrogen or better quality content for those crops or not? When we dig in the literature, we see that similar environments or similar climates, such as the state of Northern New York, and they recommended for long-term no-till to add nitrogen fertilizers of 22 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare. Also, Fairmont stated if you have a no-till system, we should increase or add fertilizer of 34 if you have a no-till system. Bundy in Wisconsin, similar climate and similar type of soils, molly soils. They also stated that if you have a no-till system, you should increase the fertilizer to, or you should add fertilizers. Dickinson and Jones in Montana, they stated if you have a long-term no-till system, but only less than 1% of soil organic matter, then you add fertilizers. But if you have 3% of soil organic matter or more, then you take a credit. Also, a recent recommendation from South Dakota stated if you have a no-till system, you should add nitrogen fertilizer of 37 kilogram per hectare. Even similar studies were conducted in the Canadian Prairie. They recommended addition of nitrogen fertilizers if you have a no-till system. But what about North Dakota? Well, in the state of North Dakota, the recommendation is to give a credit if you have a long-term no-till system. This was in 2011, and based off of one study, or based on a study was conducted on a different two different tillage practices, conventional tillage versus no-till system for the wheat. And basically they came up with this conclusion because they stated that, well, the no-till system yield could be achieved if we only take a credit of 56 kilogram per hectare of nitrogen. This was also revised in 2016 by saying if you have a no-till system less than 5 years, then you add 22 kilogram. But if you have 5 years or more of no-till system, then you take a credit of 56 kilogram per nitrogen per hectare. That was again revised in 2018 and stated that if you have a no-till system less than 5 years, then you add nitrogen fertilizers of 22 kilogram per hectare. But if you have over 5% of organic matter, then you take a credit of 56 kilogram per hectare. All of those recommendations didn't take into consideration the difference of tillage treatment, which will cause differences in soil moisture. This is exactly how the recommendation looked like in NDSU, which basically it split the region into 3 different regions based, and you find your farm in what areas, whether it's on the eastern part or western part or the northern part. Then you subtract the soil test results, and then you subtract if you have any legumes, previous crop, and if you have a no-till system for over 5 years or equal to 5 years, then you actually subtract 56. And the organic matter, if you have a 5% or more, then for each 1 full% of organic matter, you subtract 56 kilogram per hectare. However, when we look at earlier studies in the state of North Dakota, all of them stated that if you want to achieve higher crop yield, then this would be correlated with higher soil moisture and addition of nitrogen fertilizers. So higher nitrogen fertilizers and higher soil moisture will result in higher crop yields. Parker in the 57, he looked at different type of soil or of the residue incorporation methods of surface residue versus the incorporation. Surface residue mimicking the no-till system, incorporating the residue with the soil, mimicking the conventional tillage. And what they came up with conclusion that the surface residue will stay dry and will not decompose as much as when we incorporate it with the soil. Therefore, the surface application of low nitrogen residue without addition of fertilizer will result in yield reduction. Doran in 1980 came to the same conclusion that subsurface residue application showed rapid decomposition versus the surface application. A study also was conducted in 2018 in North Dakota, looking at 3 different crop residue: corn, soybeans, spring wheat, and 2 different soil series. And what they came up with is that they came up with the same conclusion, or the expected conclusion, that the occurrence of immobilization. And when I say immobilization, meaning that the nitrogen will not be available to plants, will be tied up with the microorganisms. So currently in North Dakota, there is a short growing season. We're not like Nebraska and Iowa, where we have longer growing seasons. We have a short growing season, a maximum of 120 to 130 days. We have a heavy crop residue accumulation due to the conservation tillage. We also need to count or take into consideration the difference in soil moisture due to the difference in tillage treatment practice. And there is a lack of data to support the current recommendation. So our question comes to, is nitrogen actually mineralizing from those residue or not? So we conducted 3 studies, 3 lab incubation studies. And the first one was crop residue contribution to soil nitrogen mineralization and immobilization in no-till crop fields in North Dakota. The second experiment is about the type and quantity of crop residue and freeze and thaw contribution to soil and mineralization in no-till systems. The third experiment is about the interaction effects of mixed crop residue and soil freeze and thaw on plant available nitrogen. The first experiment, our objectives were to measure nitrogen mineralization potential for the common individual crop residues in the region and to evaluate the nitrogen mineralization potential within the common soil series of the region. We selected 7 common crop residues, and 2 out of those 7 are cover crops. Corn, you see 73, that represent the C/N ratio. Wider C/N ratio, meaning it takes longer for the nitrogen or for the material to decompose. Narrower C/N ratio means it has more nitrogen available. And we see corn, soybean, winter wheat, spring wheat, flax, and the last 2, winter pea and forage radish, are cover crops with narrow C/N ratio. We used Sanford and Smith method, which we mixed the 15 gram of soil and 15 gram of sand. The sand, the purpose for us to mix the sand with the soil, it's inert, but also to facilitate leaching, especially when we deal with Fargo soil, because it's heavy. Otherwise, it's going to take a long time to leach all the samples. And also we mix the 0.5 gram of crop residue based on the 7 treatment that we have. And we had another leaching, like we had 7 treatments plus 1 control, the soil by itself. We had about bi-weekly leaching of the incubation. It's about 20-week period. Every 2 weeks we leach our samples. And we had 3 different soil types: Fargo, Foreman, Hemidile. The residue application in here were mixed with the residue. And what we did is we did our leaching experiment in controlled environment where moisture and temperature kept in optimum temperature and optimum moisture to expedite the process of nitrogen mineralization. Soils were characterized for the electric conductivity, for organic matter, for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, soil pH, sand, silt, and clay percent. Fargo displayed in the table in here, as you see, the organic matter has the highest amount of organic matter among the soils we have. Foreman was the second one, then Hemidile displayed the least amount of organic matter. Our result showed that radish, which is highlighted in red, was the only crop that mineralizing versus the soil by itself. If we look at the cumulative or overall mean, you will see that radish versus the soil was the only one that's mineralizing. But if you go to the Fargo, you see also the radish, but the P is acting different, which is above, right above the radish, which is not significantly different from radish and not also significantly different from the soil by itself. So start to mineralize. And it acted different than in Hemidile Emmerich soil. In the Foreman soil also, we saw that radish and P is not significantly different from the soil, but significantly different from the rest of the other treatments: corn, flax, soybean, spring wheat, winter wheat, which means those crop residue are immobilizing. Another way of looking at the mineralization in here, we see that Fargo soil displayed the widest range of mineralization and the highest amount of mineralization among the other soils. And that could be due to the organic matter, which we mentioned, it's about 6%, and also soil texture, water holding capacity, versus we see the Hemidile, which has the lowest amount of organic matter in our soil treatment in here. If we want to look at the soil from different perspective, and we want to see when will actually the mineralization peak, at what specific incubation day. This is the Hemidile, the Hemidile Emmerich soil series. And we notice that it peaks early in the growing season, maximum actually about 42 days. Now, since the Fargo soil has the highest amount of mineralization, but still we see that it peaks in about day 42, early in the growing season. Foreman soil, it peaks in day 14. So all of those, they peak early in the growing season. However, corn, flax, soybean, spring wheat, winter wheat is still immobilizing, not mineralizing, versus the control, the soil by itself without any residue adding to it. Another way of looking at the mineralization and mobilization of nitrate, the x-axis or the zero line means the soil alone. It represents the soil alone. And anything above it is mineralizing. Anything below it is immobilizing. Hemidile, fine sandy loam soil with 4% of organic matter. We see basically reddish and a little bit of the P mineralizing. The rest are immobilizing. Foreman, clay loam, 5% of organic matter. On top right, we see that reddish and P are the one that's mineralizing, the rest are immobilizing. If we go to the Fargo soil, which is silty clay, we find that it has the highest amount of organic matter, 6%, and reddish and P, the one that's mineralizing, the rest are immobilizing. So our finding is that corn, flax, for experiment 1, corn, flax, soybeans, spring wheat, winter wheat, showed a net of immobilization no matter what soil we had. Fargo radish was the only treatment that showed an overall net mineralization in all soil series over the bare soil. The greater cumulative mineralization for Fargo soil could be due to the soil texture, water holding capacity, and organic matter content. The nitrogen mineralization varies based on crop residue treatment and the C/N ratio of the material. In this study, the crop residue was incorporated into the soil to speed up the mineralization process because it will have better soil to residue contact. Further studies should include surface application of a crop residue to simulate the field conditions of no-till system because, as I mentioned, that the first experiment, we mixed the soil with the residue, or we mixed the residue with the soil. But then we decided, well, let's do a second experiment where we actually place the residue on top of the soil surface. And this is the type and quantity of a crop residue and freeze and thaw contribution to soil nitrogen mineralization in no-till systems. Our objectives for the second experiment is to evaluate if the type and quantity of a crop residue is offsetting the immobilization, to evaluate the influence of freeze and thaw on crop residue decomposition. We had in here about 6 treatments plus control: corn, forage radish, winter pea. Radish and pea are the cover crop, soybean, spring wheat, winter wheat with their C/N ratios. We also followed the same method of Sanford and Smith, mixing 15 grams of soil with 15 grams of sand, but instead of mixing the crop residue this time, we placed the crop residue on top of the soil. We only selected the Foreman soil, and what we did is we had about 5 growing seasons and 4 freeze and thaw cycles. Basically, we leached, let's say, for about bi-weekly leaching, let's say about 10 or 20 weeks or 18 weeks of leaching. And then we took ours, and that represent the annual or that represent the leaching time that represented the growing season. Then we took our leaching tubes to the freezer for about 3 weeks to 0 Celsius. And then we took out our leaching tube back to the lab, and then we started again the leaching. The freezing time, the 3 week, represented the annual freezing season. We had about 6 residue treatment: corn, abbreviated by C, soybean by S, radish, pea, spring wheat, winter wheat. This is just to demonstrate the difference between the first experiment and the second experiment. If you look on the right image, you will find that the top 3 leaching tubes represent the first experiment where the residue was mixed with the soil. So you don't see a lot of residue left in the soil surface. Still the same amount of residue. were applied. But on the second experiment, you saw the residue were applied on top of the soil surface. Something I forgot to mention is that after each growing season, when we take our leaching tubes back to the lab, we apply fresh residue. So every time we applied 0.5 gram of fresh residue. So in total, we had about 2.5 gram of crop residue. And what we found is, if we look at the first growing season, only look at the cumulative or overall mean, we find radish is the only crop that mineralizing as compared to the soil itself. Look at the second growing season, radish was the only one that's mineralizing. The third growing season, same result, but start to see the peas coming up a little bit. The fourth growing season, radish and a little bit of the pea is not significantly different from the radish nor from the soil alone. And in the fifth cycle or fifth growing season, we see radish and pea not significantly different from the soil, but the rest are immobilizing. Also, we noticed that overall cycle mean, and those numbers, if you see, for example, the first overall cycle mean 4.95, that does not represent soil only by itself. That represents the whole cycle, overall cycle mean. And we see that the fourth and fifth cycle is significantly different and displayed the highest amount of mineralization versus the first, second, third growing season. The mineralization, the mean nitrate mineralization by incubation cycle, that we see that the first cycle, radish is the one that's mineralizing. Then the second cycle, radish, and start to see pea a little bit coming up. The third cycle, we see radish, and we see the pea. And the fourth and fifth, we start to see the soil alone or soil only start to also have more mineralization, but the rest are immobilizing. And that could be due to the freeze and thaw impact. Another way of looking at the mineralization and mobilization of nitrate, we see that the zero line is represented or the soil only is represented by the X, which is the zero line. And anything above it is mineralizing, anything below it is immobilizing. Radish and pea are the only one that's mineralizing, the rest are immobilizing. Remember when I talked about the soil only and we said that the soil start to have more like mineralization in the fourth and fifth? That's a figure where we show only the soil. And we see that the fourth and fifth cycle is significantly different from the first three growing seasons. And also, if we want to look at what specific day it peaks early in the growing season, about day 42 for cycle 4. And for cycle 5 is about the first 4 leaching, and then it starts to go down. This is the full picture of what happened in the second experiment. Radish and pea are the one that's mineralizing. The rest are immobilizing: corn, winter wheat, soybeans, spring wheat. By the end of the experiment, this is a picture of the amount of crop residue left in the soil surface. We see the corn crop residue and we see the soybean crop residue. And those looks like they did not even decompose. Again, can you imagine what's happening actually in the field? So our finding is that accumulation of a crop residue on top of the soil surface did not increase soil nitrate mineralization. The narrow C/N ratio crop residue treatment influenced the rate of nitrate mineralization, as was evident with the radish and pea crop residue treatments. The wide C/N ratio crops, such as corn, soybeans, spring wheat, winter wheat, exhibited the patterns of soil nitrate immobilization. There could be a freeze and thaw impact on the mineralization process in here. One limitation of this study that we had or we applied similar crop residue, like the first growing season, for example, for the one of the leaching tubes says corn, then the second growing season we applied the same crop residue, corn. The third, corn. So it was homogeneous crop residue on the soil surface. But in reality, in the field, we don't have that happening. We have mixed crop residue applications, sometimes even mixed with cover crops. And what we did basically is we came up with the third experiment, the experiment that called interaction effects of mixed crop residue, white C/N ratio mixed with narrow C/N ratio, and looking also as well at the soil thaw freeze and thaw impact on the plant available nitrogen. Our objectives for experiment 3 were to determine the soil in mineralization and immobilization in the common sequence crops in North Dakota rotations for long-term metal system. To determine soil nitrogen mineralization or immobilization when we incorporate high C/N ratio with low C/N ratio. To evaluate the impact of freeze and thaw cycles on the nitrate mineralization. If you noticed in here, we have different, we have the same crop residues, corn, radish, soybean, spring wheat, the same names, but different actually crop residues because we ran out from the crop residue that we had for experiment 1 and 2. That's why we have different C/N ratios in here. Corn is displayed by 57, radish by about 12, soybean by about 70, spring wheat by about 43. So we only had in here radish as a cover crop. And the radish is known to scavenge nitrate from the soil. The method, we used Sanford and Smith method. We applied 15 of soil. We mix it with 15 grams of sand to facilitate leaching. And also we applied the of individual crop residue. We had 3 growing season. Let's say we had a bi-weekly leaching of about 14 weeks. And then we took our sample to the freezer. The leaching period were represented the growing season, the freezing point representing annual season. Were on top of the soil only the foreman soil, and it was also conducted in lab controlled moisture or controlled environment where the moisture and temperature were controlled. Those are our treatments. We had 2 controls, the soil and the radish as well. And we had 2-year rotation, 3-year rotation, 3-year with cover crop rotation. For example, I'll explain about the 2-year. If you see C, that means the first growing season for the whole period of leaching. Let's say if it is 6 or 7 leaching period, then we say, okay, we only apply 0.5 gram of the crop residue in the early of a growing season, and then we keep doing the leaching on them bi-weekly. And then when we freeze our samples, we bring them back, we apply the other crop residue. If it is designated for C, then we put the corn. If it is designated for S, we place the soybean. 3-year with cover crop, you see SW/R. That means spring wheat mixed with 15% of radish. SR means soybean. This is the second growing season. Soybean mixed with radish. The radish was about 15% from the total mass of the residue itself. And what we found is that the first soil or the first growing season, radish was the only crop residue that was mineralizing versus the soil. And everything else were immobilizing. But there was some potential, especially in the highlighted green area, where those are the 3-year crop rotation mixed with the cover crop. Especially for the first one, we see the spring wheat radish. It displayed some potential of mineralization, but still is immobilizing. The second growing season, radish was the only crop that mineralizing versus the soil, but also it showed some potential, still immobilizing. The third growing season, radish was the only one that's mineralizing, but the cover crop is still but the cover crop mixed with the cover crop, the spring wheat residue, and mixed with the cover crop, and soybean residue mixed with the cover crop, all of those represented and showed some potential of mineralization. Overall incubation cycle mean, we see that the first growing season and the third growing season displayed the highest amount of mineralization and significantly different from the second growing season. Now, when we look at this figure, 0 is represent the soil alone, and anything above it is mineralizing, anything below it is immobilizing. If we look at the first growing season, we notice that spring wheat with the radish showed some potential mineralization early in the growing season, specifically at day 28, and uptick in day 70. With season 2, everything were immobilizing except the radish. Season 3, we see 3 different potentials: spring soybean radish, corn, and spring wheat radish. That's highlighted or that's underlined because that's during this time when we actually added the residue and we leached, and after we leached, that's what we found. It's also for the second one, we see spring wheat radish, soybean radish, and corn. And the last one, spring wheat, soybean spring wheat. This is representing a 2-year rotation. We saw that they were mineralizing early in the growing season at day 14. Our finding is that crop residue diversification with 2-year and 3-year rotation and 3-year rotations plus cover crop did not ultimately result in nitrogen mineralization. Narrow C-N ratios of the radish cover crop may help offset the quantity of non-cover crops in the rotation, but may not provide adequate enhanced benefit of nitrogen mineralization. The addition of radish cover crop at the 15% of the biomass did aid in the nitrate mineralization, but only in the 3rd year and early in the growing season, day 14 or 28. Incorporating cover crop in a cool environment has the potential to mitigate net nitrogen immobilization, though would need to be confirmed in a field setting. Under North Dakota climatic conditions, freeze and thaw cycle may have stimulation effect on the mineralization for crops with wide C-N ratios. Further field studies would be helpful to understand the effect of incorporating diversified common cropping system in the region with different rates of cover crop, more than 15%. The summary of our research, as I mentioned, experiment 1, where we had the residue mixed with the soil, we saw that incorporating crop residue within the soil did not mitigate nitrogen immobilization. The nitrogen mineralization was different for each soil series due to the organic matter content, soil texture, water holding capacity. For experiment 2, when we applied the residue on top of the soil surface, but we had homogeneous crop residue, we came up with the conclusion that accumulation of crop residue on top of the soil did not increase nitrogen mineralization, but there was some potential of the freeze and thaw cycle on nitrogen mineralization. However, only that happened for the narrow CN ratio crop residue, radish, and pea. Experiment 3, we incorporated narrow CN ratio, and the incorporation of narrow CN ratio crop residue such as radish with wide CN ratio did not offset the immobilization. Positive cumulative nitrogen mineralization potential only occurred in the third growing season from incorporating cover crop with wide CN ratio, and that happened only early in the growing season. Potential freeze and thaw stimulation effect on soil nitrogen mineralization for crops with wide CN ratios. Overall findings, most wide CN ratio crop residue will immobilize soil nitrogen in no-till system under ideal conditions. Remember, our experiments were conducted in a lab where we kept the moisture temperature in optimum, and also even the residue were in a small particle size. In reality, we won't have moisture temperature optimum. In fact, as I mentioned earlier in our slides, that moisture is one of the most variable in North Dakota, as well as temperature. Particle size is bigger. Incorporating a cover crop in a cool environment has the potential to stimulate soil nitrogen mineralization, though would need to be confirmed in a field setting at varying rates of residue application. Mineralization of nitrate may be enhanced with the additional of nitrogen fertilizer, but further detailed studies are required to confirm this. Finally, North Dakota nitrogen fertilizer recommendation should be revisited for long-term no-till systems, taking into consideration soil moisture with validated data to support the nitrogen credit or lack thereof. And finally, I would like to acknowledge and thank my advisor, Larry Cihacek, Dr. Erin Day, Dr. Shafiq Rahman, Dr. Stockwell, and Dr. Lipper, my committee member, as well as Shinwen from the statistical department and the funding agencies, North Dakota Soybean Council, North Dakota Corn Council, and North Dakota Wheat Commission. And I would leave that with any question for you.
Thank you, Rashad. Excellent talk. Do we have any questions?
I'll start out the questioning here, and I know Rashad is kind of shaking in his chair there right now. What's the reason for wanting 30% residue? You know, what's driving that in a conservation tillage system, or going to a conservation tillage system to keep 30% of the residue on the surface?
What's driving the 30% is because what's the benefit of that, you mean? Or
yeah, what is that? What says that that's the desired amount? Somebody has probably made that determination.
Well, that's what I found based on the NRCS, I think, definition. Is it's 30%, and that's due to the amount of disturbance of the soil and the amount of the passes that they go through, the farmer go through, or tillage equipment go through. That's how I understood.
Okay.
So, Rashad, I have a question about your experimental design. Did you have, since you ran statistics, I assume there were some replicates. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the experiments were set up?
Well, the experiment is similar, but also different for each experiment, for the 3 experiments. Let's, if we only take the first experiment, let's say, because it's simpler to explain a little bit. We had like about 21, I think 21 leaching tubes, and I'm just going through it just to make sure I'm not making up stuff. Okay. Yeah, we had about 7 treatment plus the control. Those are the treatment: corn, soybeans, winter wheat, spring wheat, flax, pea, and forage radish. And those were replicated 3 times for each soil series, for the Fargo, for the Foreman, for the Hemidal. And also we had the soil control from each of those soil series, replicated 3 times. What we did is we did a bi-weekly leaching of, let's say, 20 weeks, which is 10 leaching period. The first leaching period is considered the initial leaching, and that was disregarded because basically we flushed out the system with whatever we had in the residue. And we applied like different amount, first calcium chloride to flush out everything, and then the nutrient solution basically without the nutrient solution without any nitrate. And we did that for about 20 weeks. But the second experiment, what we did is we had different growing season. Basically, after, let's say, if we finished those leaching for 10 weeks, then we took our sample to the freezer for about 3 weeks, and we took them back to the lab and we applied fresh residue. And then we kept going for about 10 weeks or 12 weeks. This depends on the leaching time. And we did that for 3-4 series for the second experiment. The third experiment, instead of applying similar crop residue after we place our samples from the freezer to the lab, instead of applying the same residue, we applied different residue based on our treatment, based on the common sequence of crop rotation in long-term no-till system in North Dakota. Did I answer my question? The question?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Mhm.
Are there additional questions? Let me take a second, see if I see anything in the chat.
Let me see if there's anything in the chat also.
All right. Well, let me just ask one last. What is it about? First off, why is radish? It just seemed like the first time I saw this was why is radish first off even introduced as a cover crop? And do you know mechanistically why it's behaving so differently than the others?
Well, because it goes back to the CN ratio.
Okay.
Yeah, it goes back to the narrow CN ratio, and cover crops are crops that know to scavenge nitrate from the soil, and they basically blend them to eliminate or to prevent nitrate leaching to the groundwater as an environmental measure also. And so it actually keep the environment, it saves the environment, but also it helps the farmers, because once you have that nitrate in the roots itself and in the plant itself, then you have it basically recycled back to the soil. You are not leaching it to the groundwater and polluting the groundwater.
All right, thank you very much.
I might add a little bit background. Oops. Am I on?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I might add a little background to this. Cover crops have become, a lot of people are interested in cover crops as a means of improving soil health by keeping living systems in the soil, throughout the growing season. But they're also used for, like Rashad said, to try to control loss of nutrients and maintain them. Radish is an interesting crop. It's used in cover crop mixes because of its root system. So it can help overcome some compaction problems because of its deep rooting and big, thick roots. So it leaves a root channel after it dies. The thing about the difference between the cover crops and the other crops is post-harvest, what you've got left out there, there's not much nitrogen, and you've taken the nitrogen off, at least what the plant is taken up in the grain. You've taken that out of the field. but you've got to break down this residue. And the radish, you know, the whole idea here behind using the radish was that it does accumulate a lot of nitrate. It contains a lot of nitrate. In fact, the first flush that we would run through any one of these leachings, where we would add new material, the radish was just loaded with nitrate. And so that's why we're not using that. The first leaching is to, we've got dry soil, so we add moisture to it. We also get all of the nitrate that is there either from the soil source or any other source out of the system, so that we can measure just the mineralization part of the process. So there's a lot more things than Rashad could talk about in 40 minutes here, but it's looking sort of at the system, the soil system, in interaction with the crops and the residues on the surface. So there's a lot of other little nuances in there that that are really hard to cover, but that sort of gives the background of why the radish
Very
comes
good.
into play.
All right. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Rashad. And
Thank
I'll clap for you.
you. Thank you.
And other folks can give thumbs up or unmute themselves and clap. And
Hmm.
thanks again.
You're welcome.
See you on Monday at your defense.
See you. Thank you. Bye-bye.